One of the most perplexing mysteries in the history of human evolution is how we were able to transition from small hunter-gatherer bands to well-ordered functional civilizations, ranging from a few hundred individuals to several thousand. For the nearly 200,000 years which our species has existed, the hunting and gathering lifestyle to which we have evolved predominated until about 10,000 years ago, which is when the Neolithic Revolution began. This is when humans developed agriculture, and their group size began to increase, eventually developing into the large city-states of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. In an amazingly short period of time, we have gone from only being able to form small bands to living in enormous, stable cities. The problem for psychohistorians is understanding what kind of psychological changes would allow for humans to cooperate and form such large groups. The issue with large groups is that they are difficult to control. When primate social groups exceed a certain level, splintering usually occurs, where the group breaks off and forms subgroups, as the dominant individuals compete with one another. The question becomes, how were humans able to avoid group splintering? There are many proposed solutions for how humans could cooperate on a larger scale, but the bicameral mind hypothesis proposes that humans evolved a specialized kind of psychological system which helped in controlling their behavior and structuring their societies into rigid hierarchies. This mentality also coincided with and was dependent on the idea of gods, which can be viewed as a psychological tool which enabled humans to form larger and larger groups without splintering. The word bicameral means the condition of being divided into two chambers, and the bicameral mind refers to the fact that the two hemispheres of the human brain may have had different functions, and this split allows for human behavior to be more easily controlled. Jaynes describes this mentality in the following way. At one time, human nature was split in two, an executive part called a god and a follower part called a man. Neither part was conscious. The right hemisphere can roughly be described as the god part of this psychology, while the left hemisphere can be understood as the man side. Orders and commands originated from the right hemisphere and were delivered to the left hemisphere using an auditory hallucination, which the person then obeyed. But what was this mentality like? It can be described as a psychological system where a person feels as though they are commanded by gods, who come in the form of voices which tell the person what to do. Since this mentality precedes consciousness, bicameral humans had no sense of self, no ego, and could not narratize the way modern people do. Bicameral men were noble automatons who knew not what they did. In contrast to our modern state of consciousness, the bicameral mind, as proposed by Julian Jaynes, is a significantly different kind of human mentality, and it is immensely difficult to understand what it would have been like for our early ancestors. One thing that may be particularly difficult to wrap our minds around is the fact that these voices sound just like real voices, as though someone were really talking, telling the person what to do. We do know, however, that such hallucinations do exist, and they really do sound like real, audible voices. This can be seen in people who suffer from schizophrenia, as one patient noted in describing his voices to the doctor. "Yes, sir, I hear voices distinctly, even loudly. They interrupt us at this moment. It is more easy for me to listen to them than to you. I can more easily believe in their significance and actuality, and they do not ask questions." Jaynes hypothesized that the voices heard by schizophrenic patients are similar to the voices heard in bicameral times. Schizophrenia today is considered a dysfunctional state of mind, but in the bicameral past, as mankind was becoming more civilized, this mentality would have been a significant survival advantage, especially over the state of non-consciousness. Even people who are not schizophrenic occasionally experience auditory hallucinations during stress-inducing situations. Because we know that such voices exist, there must be some innate structure evolved in the human brain which allows for them. It is possible that in the past, evolution selected for people who experienced auditory hallucinations, and modern schizophrenia is a carryover from a time when this state of mind was a survival advantage. Jaynes notes that the relationship between a schizophrenic patient and their voices often vary between patients. The voices in schizophrenia take any and every relationship to the individual. They converse, threaten, curse, criticize, consult, often in short sentences. They admonish, console, mock, command, or sometimes simply announce everything that's happening. They yell, whine, sneer, and vary from the slightest whisper to a thunderous shout. Often the voices take on some special peculiarity, such as speaking very slowly, scanning, rhyming, or in rhythms, or even in foreign languages. There may be one particular voice, more often a few voices, and occasionally many. As in bicameral civilizations, they are recognized as gods, angels, devils, enemies, or a particular person or relative. Occasionally, hallucinations also had a visual component. These instances are rare, and it is unclear whether they played a role in volition during the bicameral eras of history. If they did, we could imagine a god appearing in a visual hallucination in order to give an order, and a person would have no idea that they were only seeing a hallucination. This occurs in schizophrenics, sometimes in very interesting ways. Occasionally, in what are called acute twilight states, whole scenes, often of a religious nature, may be hallucinated even in broad daylight, the heavens standing open with a god speaking to the patient. These voices often assume a controlling and commanding nature, demanding that the person perform certain actions, and it is frequently very difficult for schizophrenics to resist the urge to follow and obey them. Very often the voices criticize a patient's thoughts and actions. Sometimes they forbid him to do what he was just thinking of doing, and sometimes this occurs even before the patient is aware of his intention. Jaynes describes one remarkable case of volition, or in other words, decision-making, being controlled by an auditory hallucination. One sunny afternoon, a man was lying back in a deck chair on the beach at Coney Island. Suddenly, he heard a voice so loud and clear that he looked about at his companions, certain that they too must have heard the voice. When they acted as if nothing had happened, he began to feel strange and moved his chair away from them. And then, suddenly, clearer and deeper, and even louder than before, the deep voice came at me again, right in my ear this time, and getting me tight and shivery inside. "Larry Jason, I told you before you weren't any good. Why are you sitting here making believe you are as good as anyone else, when you are not? Whom are you fooling?" The deep voice was so loud and so clear, everyone must have heard it. He got up and walked away slowly, down the stairs of the boardwalk to the stretch of sand below. He waited to see if the voice came back. It did, its words pounding this time, not the way you hear any words, but deeper, as though all parts of me had become ears, with my fingers hearing the words, and my legs, and my head too. "You're no good," the voice said slowly, in the same deep tones. "You've never been any good or use on Earth. There's the ocean. You might as well just drown yourself. Just walk in and keep walking." As soon as the voice was through, I knew by its cold command I had to obey it. Mr. Jason waded into the Atlantic Ocean to drown. Against the will of his voices, he was saved by lifeguards and brought to Bellevue Hospital, where he recovered to write of this bicameral experience. Since the voices originate from the right hemisphere, they tend to reveal information which the right hemisphere is obtaining from the environment. As the right hemisphere makes perceptions, it is able to deliver this information to the left hemisphere using an auditory hallucination, or as Jaynes explains, "Of immense importance here is the fact that the nervous system of a patient makes simple perceptual judgments of which the patient's self is not aware, and these may then be transposed into voices that seem prophetic. A janitor coming down a hall may make a slight noise, of which the patient is not conscious, but the patient hears his hallucinated voice cry out, 'Now someone is coming down the hall with a bucket of water.' Then the door opens and the prophecy is fulfilled. Credence in the prophetic character of the voices, just as perhaps in bicameral times, is thus built up and sustained. The patient then follows his voices alone and is defenseless against them." This patient's example helps to illustrate what life was like for a bicameral man. He would go about his day with no awareness until a voice which sounded to him like a real voice directed him in some way based on the information that the right hemisphere obtained. Despite the fact that the individual feels like these voices are coming from outside of him, these auditory hallucinations actually originate from within the person's brain, probably their right hemisphere, just as the internal monologue of conscious individuals originate from the left hemisphere. However, bicameral humans would believe that the voices originate from the outside world, in contrast to conscious people who feel that their inner monologue originates from within and that they are the cause of their own thoughts. But how do we know that these voices originated from the right hemisphere? There are several reasons why this might be the case. The two hemispheres of the brain are not perfectly symmetrical in terms of functioning. Most brain regions are lateralized, meaning that they can be found on both hemispheres. However, this is not true for speech, which only appears on one hemisphere, and in most people this is the left. Some ambidextrous people do actually have speech areas on both hemispheres, but this is a relatively rare phenomenon. Jaynes remarks that, "One intriguing puzzle which has long fascinated me and anyone else who has considered the evolution of all of this is why language function should be represented in only one hemisphere. Most other important functions are bilaterally represented. This redundancy in everything else is a biological advantage to the animal, since if one side is injured, the other side can compensate. Why then was not language?" The most important speech area is known as Wernicke's area, because damage to this area results in a permanent loss of speech, unless the person is young enough so that the other hemisphere can take over the function of language control. These areas on the right side of the brain that correspond to Wernicke's area on the left seem to have no function on the right side. It is clear that despite the fact that only the left hemisphere can speak, both hemispheres are able to understand language. Even when the entire left hemisphere, the speech hemisphere, remember, is removed in human patients suffering from glioma, the remaining right hemisphere immediately after the operation seems to understand the surgeon's questions, though unable to reply. However, experiments have shown that electrically stimulating these areas on the right hemisphere, the non-speaking hemisphere, remember, can actually produce auditory hallucinations. When stimulated in this region, case 7, a 20-year-old college student cried out, "Again, I hear voices. I sort of lost touch with reality. Humming in my ears, and a small feeling like a warning." And when stimulated again, "Voices, the same as before. I was just losing touch with reality again." The patient's description of losing touch with reality is reminiscent of them temporarily losing conscious awareness as the voices acted upon them. In another example, a 14-year-old girl, case 15, when stimulated on the superior posterior gyrus of the right temporal lobe, cried out, "Oh, everybody is shouting at me again, make them stop." The stimulus duration was 2 seconds. The voices lasted 11 seconds. She explained, "They are yelling at me for doing something wrong. Everybody is yelling." At all stimulation points along the posterior temporal lobe of the right hemisphere, she heard yelling, and even when stimulated 1.5 inches posterior to the first point, she cried out, "There they go, yelling at me, stop them," and the voices coming from just one stimulation lasted 20 seconds. These results show that the right hemisphere may have structures for producing hallucinations, which are no longer needed in the modern world, but can be reactivated with stress or through electrical stimulation. If Jaynes' theory about the right hemispheric origin of auditory hallucinations is correct, then it is almost as if the right hemisphere is attempting to communicate with the left hemisphere, but because the patient's sense of self originates from the left hemisphere, they don't identify the hallucination as coming from themselves, although in reality, the hallucination is expressing information which the right hemisphere has. Let's take some time to think about how creepy this is. It is as if the right hemisphere has difficulty asserting itself in behavior, and so tries to talk to the left hemisphere in a non-conscious way. If we examine the structure of these areas of the brain more closely, we discover a connection between the two speech areas via a collection of brain cells called the anterior commissures, and Jaynes believes that this acts as a bridge to send messages between the hemispheres. Here then, I suggest, is the tiny bridge across which came the directions which built our civilizations and founded the world's religions, where God spoke to men and were obeyed because they were human volition. Perceptions made by the right hemisphere are communicated to the other side of the brain through language. Consider the evolutionary problem. Billions of nerve cells processing complex experience on one side and needing to send the results over to the other through the much smaller commissures. Some code would have to be used, some way of reducing very complicated processing into a form that can be transmitted through the fewer neurons, particularly of the anterior commissures. And what better code has ever appeared in the evolution of animal nervous systems than human language? One of the main hypotheses of this theory is that the two hemispheres of the brain are capable of acting like independent persons. Experiments in patients who have undergone split brain operations reveal that this is true. Recall that the left hemisphere is associated with the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere is associated with the left side of the body. Imagine that you had undergone a split brain operation, and now your brain hemispheres were disconnected, and imagine that these two images were placed in the field of your vision, such that only one hemisphere saw this image, and the other saw this one. To your left hemisphere, this side of the screen would appear to be a blank. This picture on the left would appear in the right hemisphere, but since the right hemisphere cannot speak, the person says that they cannot see anything on the left. It is as if you, whatever that means, were in your left hemisphere, and now with the commissures cut, could never know or be conscious of what a quite different person, once also you, in the other hemisphere, was seeing or thinking about. Two persons in one head. A similar experiment produces a similar, intriguing result. If two different figures are flashed simultaneously to the right and left visual fields, as, for example, a $sign on the left and a question mark on the right, and the subject is asked to draw what he saw, using the left hand out of sight under a screen, he draws the $sign. But asked what he has just drawn out of sight, he insists it was the question mark. In other words, the one hemisphere does not know what the other hemisphere has been doing. The right hemisphere also has various characteristics which make it suitable for the role of being a commanding god. According to Jaynes, the function of the gods was chiefly the guiding and planning of action in novel situations. The gods size up problems and organize action according to an ongoing pattern or purpose, resulting in intricate bicameral civilizations, fitting all of the disparate parts together, planting times, harvest times, the sorting out of commodities, all the vast putting together of things in a grand design, and the giving of directions to the neurological man in his verbal analytical sanctuary in the left hemisphere. If this is true, then we would expect the right hemisphere to have the structures and functions needed for its role as a commanding god. Differences between the hemispheres do point to this possibility. The fact that the right hemisphere is, unlike the left hemisphere, able to recognize faces may be reflective of one of the functions of the god mentality. The inability to recognize faces is one of the symptoms of right hemisphere damage. One important function for a human being of any century is the recognition of facial expression, particularly in regard to friendly or unfriendly intent. If a bicameral man saw an unrecognized man coming toward him, it would be of considerable survival value for the god side of his mentality to decide if the person was of friendly or unfriendly intent. The right hemisphere is also better at organizing details into a perceptual whole, meaning that it is better able to make quick judgments about the environment. The right hemisphere is more involved in synthetic and spatial constructive tasks, while the left hemisphere is more analytic and verbal. The right hemisphere, perhaps like the gods, sees parts as having meaning only within a context. It looks at wholes. The left hemisphere, or dominant hemisphere, like the man side of the bicameral mind, looks at parts themselves. The right hemisphere is also better at sorting shapes, colors, and patterns, and it is often better at solving puzzles such as mazes. If these hallucinations operated in the manner we have discussed, what causes them to be released? The answer to this, just as it is in schizophrenia, is simply stress. Stress occurs whenever a decision needs to be made due to a new or unexpected situation, and experimental evidence is in clear agreement with this. If two monkeys are placed in harnesses, in such a way that one of the monkeys can press a bar at least once every 20 seconds to avoid a periodic shock to both monkeys' feet, within 3 or 4 weeks, the decision-making monkey will have ulcers, while the other, equally shocked monkey will not. It is the pause of unknowingness that is important, for if the experiment is so arranged that an animal can make an effective response and receive immediate feedback of his success, executive ulcers, as they are often called, do not occur. Bicameral men had a different pattern of behavior when compared to conscious people. In a novel situation, conscious men need to narratize out what to do, but bicameral men would be told what to do by their right hemispheres in the form of an auditory hallucination. This was perceived to be a god. The only stress necessary was that which occurs when a change in behavior is necessary because of some novelty in a situation. Anything that cannot be dealt with on the basis of habit, any conflict between work and fatigue, between attack and flight, any choice between whom to obey or what to do, Anything that required any decision at all was sufficient to cause an auditory hallucination. Whenever a stressful situation occurs, which cannot simply be resolved instinctually, the stress would cause an auditory hallucination, which would direct the man purposefully. This system also has the advantage of allowing humans to persist at more complicated tasks which unconscious men would have difficulty with. Let us consider a man commanded by himself or his chief to set up a fish weir far upstream from a campsite. If he is not conscious, and cannot therefore narratize the situation, and so hold his analog eye in a spatialized time, with its consequences fully imagined, how does he do it? It is only language, I think, that can keep him at this time-consuming, all-afternoon work. A Middle Pleistocene man would forget what he was doing, but lingual man would have language to remind him, either repeated by himself, which would require a type of volition which I do not think he was then capable of, or, as seems more likely, by a repeated internal verbal hallucination telling him what to do. The explanation of volition in subjective conscious men is still a profound problem that has not reached any satisfactory solution, but in bicameral men, this was volition. Another way to say it is that volition came as a voice that was in the nature of a neurological command, in which the command and the action were not separated, in which to hear was to obey. The pervasiveness of gods in human history is reflective of the fact that gods were once very important in the functioning of society, and in the volition of human individuals. Our modern religions seem to be the heritage of an ancient time when the gods played a more direct role in human affairs. But why gods? Or in other words, why this particular relationship between a god and his follower? In an upcoming video, we will discuss how primate evolution gave rise to the idea of gods, and how this led to a significant change in human social behavior.